Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Power Core Productions and Podcastings. I'm your host, Javon Harrington, back to hit you with another video, and today we're going to be continuing What If Deku Was a Power Ranger Heroes of the Morphing Grid Part 10. Now for this part, we are going to be wrapping up Season 4 of My Hero Academia, and next week we're going to be getting into the second movie, My Hero Academia Heroes Rising. That's going to be covered in this story as well. So I do hope you guys will stay tuned for that. Also, before we get into today's story, I do want to briefly mention that there are going to be some parts that I'm not going to cover in this portion of the story simply because there's no real reason to. So whatever I don't cover in depth or in detail, just assume that it happened the same way that it happened in canon. So there's nothing that you really need to worry about, like Tamaki in his fight or Kirishima in his fight. Deku being a Power Ranger doesn't change any of those fights or interactions or outcomes, so I'm simply not going to go over them in this story simply because there wouldn't be much of a reason to. We are going to hit a bit of a lull after the movie, as you know, in Season 5. While the story does progress, it's not a whole lot of action, although there are going to be some things that I plan to do. So I do hope you'll stay tuned for that when that video comes out, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. I do want to say thank you to everyone who has been understanding of what I've been going through recently. If you don't know, I currently have a family member who is in the hospital right now, not really doing too well, so I've kind of been a bit preoccupied with some of my work and helping out my family as well, so I haven't been able to get out my videos as much as I'd like to, although thankfully I was able to take some time out earlier tonight to record this video, so I do hope that you guys will enjoy it as well. And also I hope you enjoyed the Power Core discussions video that I was hopefully able to drop earlier today. I had that pre-recorded earlier in the week and I wasn't sure when I was going to drop it, but I figured I would, so I do hope you guys will enjoy that. And if there's any other type of discussion videos you want to do on the channel, then that will be taken into consideration, and I'll try to make videos on that whenever possible. But again, I do want to say thank you to everyone who supports Power Core Productions and Podcastings. Like I always say, you make the channel grow, you make the core grow. But anyway, without further ado, let's get into today's video. Take it away. For many of the heroes in the room, the very idea of a young girl being subjected to such inhumane tortures as a way to manufacture and create the quirky racing bullets was more than a shock and what many were expecting. However, of all of the heroes in the room, the two that took it to heart the most was Izuku and Mirio, both of them lamenting in their failures to have saved Eri when they had the chance. Izuku especially, knowing full well that he had her in his arms. A few of the other pro heroes, most notably Rocklock, would take to chastising the two boys for not taking the girl away when they did, believing that if they had done so, they would have saved them much trouble, making them both resent and feel even worse than before. However, Sir Nine-Eye would quickly interject, explaining that it was his own oversight that caused this situation, that he had sent them into the field with the expressed warning to not draw any attention to themselves, and that they had acted under his jurisdiction. However, even still, they were able to gain much insight as to where the Shie Hassaikai were hiding, Sir Nine-Eye using his foresight quirk on one of their members, being able to pinpoint their location as he was able to see one of them in particular buying a particular toy that was used for Eri. With the time for the raid being set up and the hero agencies being gathered together, Izuku had nothing to do except wait for this time to get another chance to save Eri. However, the other rangers could see that Izuku was taking this to heart especially, none more so than his successor and teacher in All Might, who noticed Izuku was rather off in his training with One for All. Even with all the training and everything he had been given up until now, trying to balance two quirks on top of his ranger powers seemed to be more than what he could handle. Sure, in his morph form he could handle the usage of One for All to an extent, although it did put a massive strain on his body. Combining One for All with his morphed form drained how long he could stay morphed for a particular period of time, as it seemed as though the will of the morphing grid put itself into overdrive to keep Izuku from breaking his body apart. But even still, the morphed suit had its limits, and at the moment, Deku simply just wasn't strong enough to access it at full power. On top of that, and even more so, he already had his own original fire quirk to deal with, something that he still had to harness and get used to. He wasn't like Todoroki, who was naturally born training with the quirk. Deku had only had his green flames for a little over 6 months to a year, whereas Todoroki had been training with it since birth. Even if he took breaks, he was still pretty used to it. Even Bakugo with his explosions was able to handle the heat to an extent. Even for all the power that he had, he knew that he still had much more that he needed to learn. One day, as he was training alone in the practice hall, while the other rangers had already since wrapped up their training and were preparing to go back to the dorms, All Might would stop Izuku and ask what was troubling him. Of course, Izuku couldn't talk about the case in full, even to All Might. But even still, he wanted to share his own feelings with his master. He would ask All Might simply if there was ever a person that he couldn't save, and what exactly he was supposed to do in that moment. All Might would understand where Izuku was coming from, and he would explain that there were plenty of people in the world that he hadn't saved. Even for all of the great things that All Might had done as the symbol of peace, there were still people out there in the world who would cry out his name. Many people who would cry to their dying breaths for All Might to save them, even though he knew plainly that he could just never be there. And that was something that kept him up at night. Izuku would then ask what exactly he was supposed to do. What did he do if, even with all the power he had been given, he still couldn't save just the one person that needed him the most? And All Might would simply tell him that in those moments, a hero had to have a strong will, to have the ability to move forward in spite of the challenges, and that even still, Deku showed the heart of a true hero, and that he must continue down the path that he had gone. Izuku would take this to heart. However, even still, the other rangers would attempt to help him as best they could. Uraraka was fully aware of what was happening, as she too was a part of the Shie Hassaikai raid arc team. However, even still, the other rangers tried to support Deku in any ways that they could, each one offering their support to an extent. Bakugo in his own way took to training Deku extra hard, not relenting in the punishment when they sparred going one-on-one, remarking that if he were going to be the number one hero, then he didn't have time for dealing with things like doubt, because if he sensed that weakness even for a moment, he would definitely take the lead, because he did not intend to lose that spot, not to anyone. Eventually, after preparation had been made and everything had been set into motion, Sir Nai would gather all of the heroes together as the raid on the base of the Shie Hassaikai Yakuza would soon go into effect. In the meantime, Overhaul was enthralled with the technology he was working with. He had had some of his best men look at the morpher that he had been given by Shigaraki. Shigaraki taking the broken morpher that he had been given by Rita Repulsa before she escaped back to her home dimension, having failed to capture the Ranger powers. While he didn't completely understand the morphing grid and how it worked, he felt as though this morpher could be useful, and that the keys to true power lied within it. Of course, he had no idea of just how far the extent of the history of the Rangers went. However, even still, if there was any type of power out there in the world that could allow him to contend with the Rangers, especially the Green Ranger, then he was going to take it. However, not much could have been gathered though. Although from what they could see, the morpher appeared to be linked to some form of energy. If they could just figure out how to tap into it, then maybe that could provide him the edge that he needed. Overall, was quite intrigued with this new form of technology, thinking that it could add to the Shie Hassaikai growing back to prominence as it had once before. And he had even begun making his own plans to try to get in on the morphing technology. He had seen on the news how the Power Rangers worked and operated. If they were able to control giant robots and things of that nature, all due to those little morphers of theirs, then there was definitely some intrigue on his part. With all the data that had been collected, Shigaraki would take back the morpher, and would still aid the Shie Hassaikai with the League of Villains. Although, in discretion, he made it very clear to his subordinates that they were not working with them, but they were just waiting for the opportune time. Eventually the day of the raid would come. Izuku, Uraraka, Kirishima, and Froppy, along with Sir Night-Eye, Mirio, Tamaki, Nejire, Fat Gum, Ryukuo, and all the other heroes who had been assigned to the case would gather together. With the warrant they had gotten from the Tokyo police, eventually the raid would begin, with small battles breaking out all across the area. A few of the Shie Hassaikai, who had been quirk users, using their abilities to the fullest, separating the group at various points. Deku now morphed into the Green Ranger form, enhancing himself with small doses of One for All, as he didn't want to burn out of his morphed form as quickly as possible, would move through the inner workings of the basement area of the compound of the Shie Hassaikai, along with Mirio, who would be using his permeation quirk to slip through the walls as quickly as possible. Mr. Aizawa was also there as well, morphed in his ninja form. What many of his students were not aware of was that Mr. Aizawa had actually been looking into passing down the power. It wasn't that he didn't like being a ranger, but it was just that in the grand scheme of things, it just simply wasn't his style. Although now that he had gotten a good feel for what the powers were and the sensation, then he felt as though that was all that he needed in terms of training the next generation of rangers. And while he did have a student in mind who he planned to pass the powers down to, he knew that he needed to use them in this very moment to aid in the battle against the Shie Hassaikai and in the rescue of Eri. Eventually, as the group made its way down to the basement level, they would come across one of the members, a member with the ability to move and transform the walls around them, distorting and throwing off their equilibrium. Mr. Aizawa, with the enhanced power of the Ranger powers, was able to use them to a greater extent, stopping most of the hallways in its tracks and pinpointing the exact location of the villain, taking him out swiftly. With less time that was being wasted, the group made their way through the basement levels as quickly as possible. However, the more they tried to get down to the lower levels, the more the walls had been transformed or remodeled, as Overhaul was using his quirk to reshape the halls in and of themselves, creating barriers and different blocks at various turns, stopping and deterring the heroes and slowing them down. Mirio knew fully well what was at stake and decided to rush on ahead. However, before leaving, Deku, thinking on his feet, would give Mirio something else that he might need. He would take off the dragon's shield and hand it to Mirio, telling him to wear it and use it as an extra layer of protection, not knowing when they might use the quirk erasing bullets. Mirio would thank him for it as he would take the dragon's shield and place it on himself. With his cape now behind him, Mirio would then dash through under the inner layers as quickly as possible, until eventually he would come face to face with Overhaul. Mirio, now seeing the villain for who he truly was, he would confront him as the two would go face to face. Overhaul would be impressed by Mirio and his abilities, Mirio becoming more and more sickened at Overhaul the longer the fight went on. He would come to learn that Eri was not in fact his daughter, but was actually the daughter of the previous head of the Shie Hisakai, the head that had been taken out, as Overhaul had his own ambitions and his own ways of reinventing the Yakuza and bringing them back into an era of prominence. However, even still, he had no intention of losing to the wannabe heroes. Along with his partner in Nemoto, they would attempt to try to use the quirk erasing bullets to take out Mirio as quickly as possible. However, his permeation quirk proved to be beneficial in this regard, the dragon's shield serving as extra protection. In doing so, he was able to get close enough to save Eri and get her out of the danger. However, with their exits now completely blocked, there was nowhere for them to go in that regard. Overhaul would then turn his full attention to Mirio, trying his best to take out the permeating hero, Lemillion, as quickly as possible, as Deku and the other heroes would rush down to the lower levels to get to him as soon as possible. With the dragon's shield now removed, it would free up some of the power that Deku would be able to use. As his body would begin to glow a faint green, he would slowly increase the outage of One for All, jumping from 5% to 10%, from 10% to 15%, from 15% to 20%, 20% being its absolute max as the glowing light of green would flash through the inner levels, punching and shooting his way in a burst of green flame as fast as he could down to the bottom floor. Along the way, a few members of the League of Villains, that being Twice and Toga, would see Deku flying past them. While under normal circumstances they would have tried to slow them down, this was not an instance where they wanted to get involved. Having seen what Deku could do on full display, as the other Rangers had shown their capabilities in their fight against All for One, they knew very well to be weary of the Rangers, waiting for the opportune time, until they too could receive a power increase that would allow them to take out the heroes once and for all. With Deku racing in a blaze of green flame, he would soon arrive to the bottom level. Mirio had been worn down, but thankfully the dragon's shield had been able to keep him in the fight. While he did have to focus on protecting Eri, as well as dealing with two villains at once. With the aid of the dragon's shield, he was able to get an extra layer of protection which had saved him from being shot a few times. Now starting to be annoyed more than anything, Overhaul would begin to use the ground, using the pure rock and material to create jagged spikes and edges, forcing the heroes to retreat in various different positions. As Sir Night-Eye would grab Eri and move her over to safety, and with Mirio and Deku working together, the two would turn their attentions to Overhaul. Overhaul looking down upon them in disgust, questioning their true resolve, as they didn't put that same effort into trying to save Eri the first time. In his eyes, the heroes were nothing but hypocrites, weak and disgusting liars. The world had been completely tainted by this hero society, this notion of heroes and villains, They were nothing more than a bunch of would-be cosplayers trying to play a hero, and he had had enough of it. Deku was getting sick and tired of Overhaul's words. As Muriel would return the dragon shield to him, Deku would feel the power flowing through, as sparks of green light would shine all over his suit, an eruption of green flame bursting around. The green dragon, the Dragon Ranger, had now arrived. Looking Overhaul straight in the face, Deku would declare boldly that his tyranny and evil would be brought to an end, and that they were going to save Eri no matter what. Overhaul would simply respond by shooting out his jagged-edged spikes, launching straight towards the two heroes. Deku would concentrate and condense a heavy burst of flame before blasting it in a green beam of light, the green beam burning away down to cinder the jagged rocked edges, as Muriel would go in for a close assault, his close-range combat being second to none, and Deku seeing firsthand why he was one of the big three at UA. It wasn't just a matter of his quirk, but it was how he used it. It seemed so effortlessly. He did it almost without even thinking at all. They had started to push Overhaul back to a great extent, so much more so that it forced him to get desperate. Refusing to accept defeat, he would use his quirk on his own partner, absorbing Nemeto and transforming himself into a four-armed monster. Overhaul, now working at his fullest extent, would attempt to try to wipe out Lemillion and Deku in one fell swoop, creating and destroying the terrain over and over again, making it almost difficult for them to take their footing, leaving them to be in the air multiple times. This, however, would prove to be even more dangerous, as once they were in the air, they wouldn't have complete control over their footing and landing, putting them in a dangerous position. Even still though, the two would not relent in their assault, beating down on Overhaul again and again. However, for the two, they could feel that they were reaching their limits. Muriel's moves were getting a bit sloppy. A few times he had lost his edge, and a few times he had been cut against the arm and the leg, just narrowly. Overhaul could see that he was slowly wearing down the heroes time and time again, and it would only take but for another few hits before he would eventually get where he needed to go. However, before he had a chance to even do so, Deku would come barreling in once again with his fist of flame, punching and kicking at Overhaul over and over again, the two of them engaging in a flurry of combat. Overhaul using his extra arms to try to grab and hold Deku down, but Deku would use the dragon's dagger, emitting from it green flame to its sharpest and hottest of points, cutting away at the arms, forcing the Overhaul to regrow them. As they would continue this fight over and over again of wearing down the would-be villain, the heroes would eventually be able to gain the slight upper hand. However, in their attempts to go at full power, Overhaul would use this to his advantage, waiting until they got close enough. He would then show where his true target was, not aiming for the heroes, but moving directly towards Sir Night-Eye as well as Eri. Even for Sir Night-Eye in his quickness, and for as fast as he was able to move, he would attempt to try to get Eri out of the way as quickly as possible, Muriel jumping over to attempt to save his sensei. However, in that exact moment, Sir Night-Eye would throw Eri towards Muriel, pushing the two and moving them out of the way, as he would be impaled through the stomach by one of the spikes before falling to the ground. Sir Night-Eye, now falling and laying in a pool of his own blood, would look up defiantly, Overhaul remarking that he would bring an end to all of the false heroes. Muriel would hold Eri close, Eri being scared and frightened in that moment, not sure of what she should do, believing that all of this had been her fault. Mirio was even more distraught as he went over to his fallen mentor, trying his best to hold him, to try to stop the bleeding as best he could. Overhaul would reach out with his extended arms, grabbing at Eri once again, Eri flying into the air until eventually she had landed on one of the platforms. One of the platforms suspended high in the air, standing between Overhaul and Deku. Deku could feel that he was now reaching his limit as well. His suit would begin to glow and fade in and out. He could feel the power starting to drain from him. The combination of One for All, along with his ranger powers and his own natural quirk, was all starting to take an effect on his body. He could feel himself slowly slipping in and out with each step, with each movement. It became harder and harder to dodge, until eventually one of the spikes would stab him in the leg, causing him to fall to the ground in immense pain. As Eri looked on, clutching only the cape that she had held from Mirio, trying his best to hold on to his emotions, as Sir Nai would implore for him and for Deku to run, that the two of them had to get out of there, for he had used his foresight, and he saw that if they continued on in this battle, it would only result in their deaths. Deku, however, stood in spite of that, with his ranger power now running to its lowest, not sure of what he could do at this point. If he attempted to use One for All again, it might result in him bursting out into flame, as the over-exhilaration of all of that power combined into his body, even if he had received enough training, might result in it being more than what he could handle. However, Deku had made a promise. He had made a promise to that girl, and it was a promise that he was not going to leave unfulfilled. Looking up through his cracked visor, trying his best to hold back the blood that had been forming in his mouth, Deku would yell for Eri to jump, telling her to have faith, promising that he would catch her and protect her, and that he was never going to let her go again. Eri would look back at Overhaul and then to Deku. Despite everything that she had been through at this moment, she knew that the heroes were fighting hard for her, even as Overhaul hurled his disgusting insult to Eri, stating that she were nothing more but a cursed child, a demon that brought misfortune to everyone around her, nothing more but the briar of death. Eri would block out the negativity as she took one leap of faith. Deku would focus all of his energy to his feet as he took a deep breath. From the soles of his shoes would be a burst of green flame shooting him straight into the air. As the great spikes would start to lunge towards Deku once again, Deku would put a spin as he would begin to soar through the skies, a green inferno forming around him, as the spikes would disintegrate into ash, leaving behind a trail of fire. As Deku went flying straight high, he would grab Eri and hold her close, using the cape that she had been holding onto from Mirio. Deku would wrap it around him, holding her tightly. Lemillion, now knowing what he needed to do as well, would tell his sensei that he would return, as he would jump back up, standing beside Deku. Deku felt at that moment, though, that his body was not being harmed the way it was originally. Even Mirio had to admit that it looked like he was running out of power for a moment, but now it looked as if he were back to normal. Deku felt more energized. He felt like he was back brand new. However, he would also feel as if he were slowly starting to slip away, as if the power was starting to fade from him, and that he had to actually put in more and not less. As he would do so, his body would start to glow into a bright green aura, his suit now completely restored from all of its damage, the cracked visor now completely fixed. Overhaul would yell out in anger, warning him of Erie's quirk, Rewind, and that it was restoring him back into his prime self. However, if he wasn't careful, he would eventually revert back into nothing, remarking that that was how her parents died because she couldn't control that power. However, as Erie would begin to doubt herself, believing that her power was a curse, Deku would tell her that it was a blessing, and that he was going to use that blessing and show the true resolve of a hero. Mirio and Deku would jump into the air together. Overhaul, now assimilating even more of his fallen allies, would grow in size until eventually he were a large beast of a man. At the center of that monstrous figure, Mirio, moving in first, would phase through all of his attacks before delivering his own 1,000,000 phantom punches. Mirio attacking from every direction and stunning Overhaul, as Deku, now pushing his body to the upper limit to shave off Erie's own quirk, he would find himself reaching 100%. It felt euphoric. It felt incredible. For that briefest of time, he could understand all of the power. He knew that it would only be but for a brief moment, so he had to keep his focus. He would tell Mirio to buy him some time, as he would start to condense all of the flame into his fist, the energy enveloping on itself over and over again, until eventually Deku's hands would glow a bright emerald green. As Mirio would attempt to hold off Overhaul for as long as he could, eventually it would be too much for him as he would be swatted back down into the ground. As he would look up to Deku, he would yell for him to do whatever he was going to do now, as Overhaul was now lunging straight towards Deku as he hovered above in the sky. Deku would cup both of his hands together, holding them out in front. The condensed ball of flame would let out a high-beamed sound, before eventually a green flash would emanate from his fist. The flashing green light would go barreling straight towards Overhaul, Overhaul using his monstrous form to attempt to shield himself, as Deku would yell, "Emerald Dragon Green Flame, 100%. The incinerating flames would burn away at the excess skin and at the excess muscle and tissue, until eventually Overhaul would have to use every bit of his quirk just to keep his original body intact from the flame. Deku would rear back on the power just long enough as the two would remain hovering above everything. As Overhaul looked up, the last thing he would see in the sky itself, shining brighter than even the sun, was a great flash of green, as Deku would yell out loud, "A Emerald Detroit Smash," landing square right in his face, breaking off the plague mask from it, as he would go barreling down into the ground below, crashing into the rubble, knocked completely unconscious. As Deku would come landing back into the ground, the energy starting to become more than what he could handle. He could feel that his body was starting to overheat tremendously, smoke starting to come up from his ranger's form as his suit would begin to fade in and out once again. He could feel that he was starting to go overboard into the max. He couldn't contain all of this power. The sweat starting to evaporate from his forehead, his throat starting to become increasingly dry. He could feel the vapor beginning to leave from him over and over again. If he didn't know any better, he felt as if he had been thrown into a kennel itself. Eri tried to pull back on the power, but she had no way of controlling it at the moment. Just as it seemed as though all hope was going to be lost, Mr. Aizawa, in the nick of time, would use his erasure quirk to put everything to a standstill, shutting everything down for Eri and for Izuku, as the two would then go back to normal, Eri's horn regressing tremendously into that of a tiny stub, before the two of them would collapse onto the ground, Deku holding the girl tightly. In the meantime, Mirio would be helped out of the rubble by Nejire as well, the two of them heading over to Sir Nai, getting medical attention over for him as quickly as possible. Uraraka had played a role in defeating one of the villains that they had gone up against. Thankfully, Uraraka was able to use the pterodactyl Zord to fly from a distance, as one of the villains had grown rather large inside, even matching Lady Ryukio in her dragon form. Although thankfully the pterodactyl and the dragon were able to fly together in defeating the villain once and for all. Uraraka decided to use her Zord as a way to teleport anyone that had been injured, deciding that it would be the best use of her abilities. The pterodactyl Zord landing in an open space, many of the injured and the wounded would be carted inside immediately, as she would begin flying with the help of a few other officials, beginning her trips back and forth to hospitals and respective medical facilities all across Japan, as once the villains had been defeated, now the cleanup and the safety of the others would be at the forefront of everyone's mind. With the day saved and a job well done, Mirio and Izuku would be recovering in the hospital. However, in the meantime, Sir Nai would not be doing as well. However, even still, he was amazed at what he had managed to see. Even he had to admit in the beginning he had his reservations about Izuku. He personally had always believed that Mirio was the best use as the next candidate for One for All. He even believed that Izuku would die in that very battle. However, from everything he had seen, he had now come to learn to have faith in others. As Deku and Mirio would arrive to his hospital room, All Might, along with a few of the other heroes as well, would be gathered together as Sir Nai was not going to have long for this earth. Mirio would be distraught especially, as he had felt as though now was not the time for his master to die, and that if there was anything that he could do, he wanted to do so. However, Sir Nai would reach out his hand towards Mirio, and he would reach out his hand towards Deku as well, as he used his foresight for the final time. He would smile happily, telling the two of them that they were both going to make fine heroes in this world, that they would serve as the pillars of peace. He would tell them to keep a smile on their face and to always remember to laugh. As his life would slowly drain from his body, the hero known as Sir Nai, longtime ally to the #1 hero All Might, would pass away in death. Many would be saddened by the death of Sir Nai, and the funeral would be held not too long after. Even when Deku and the other heroes had returned back to UA, many could see the strain that they had been through, their friends wanting to comfort them and help in any way that they could. However, among the Rangers, there was a lot that still needed to be discussed. During one of their meetings, as Melissa was in the command center, as she had wanted to pay her condolences as well to Deku and to Mirio, the topic would eventually come up as to Deku and what had happened to him in his fight against Overhaul, as there was a lot that needed to be explained. Deku would tell them of the sensation that he felt when Eri used her rewind quirk. He would tell them that for the briefest of moments, he felt as if One for All and the Morphing Grid were working together, and it put him in a new state of power that he couldn't even fathom. Alpha would be most intrigued by this, as he understood just how powerful Lord Dragon could be, wondering if One for All might be the key to defeating him. Deku would also go on to explain that while it was brief, he felt what it truly would be like to be at 100% power. And after the fight, he could confirm that he was nowhere ready for that level of combat, remarking that if it hadn't been for Eri, he would have died 100 times over. Everyone would be shocked by this. Just when they thought that he was making such progress, the fact that he was able to just scratch 20% was truly a testament to how powerful he was. But even there, at 20%, that was nothing more but a drop in the ocean of what was his true power, showing that he truly had a long way to go before he was ready to truly use his power to its fullest extent. Bakugo would simply scoff, telling him that if he truly felt that way, then he needed to work harder. Otherwise, he was never going to be able to be the #1 hero. Shoto leaving not too long after, as he and Bakugo already had their own training that they needed to do, as the conclusion for the Special Provisional Heroes License course was coming up. The two of them would eventually have to go and compete, along with a few others who had failed as well from Shiketsu High. Although even still, despite going through a few of the mundane, they were eventually able to get their passing grades. Now only needing to finish up a few bit of the remaining courses, they were more than halfway through their remedial class exams. Of course, there were many different things going on around this time. Izuku and Mirio had taken it upon themselves to help Eri readjust to her new life as best as they could. And there was also the looming threat of the League of Villains. As the authorities had done their raid on the Shie Hassaikai, it seemed as though all of their data, all of the tech that they had managed to gather together had been stolen. It seemed as though Shigaraki had only used them for his own means. And indeed he had. He wasn't entirely sure of what to do with the knowledge, but he knew that the key to his newfound power lay within the quirky racing bullets and the Morpher. However, before he would vanish, he would leave Overhaul with one parting gift. For the man that hated quirks the most, he made sure that he would never have to worry about using a quirk ever again. For in a few swift motions, the once proud and powerful Overhaul would be left quirkless and weak, as he cried out on the bridge he was left on, as his work and his only key to salvation had all been taken from him. As Shigaraki and the League of Villains would now go into hiding, waiting to plan out their next move, Kurogiri had been captured and was now in the custody of the police. The new hero rankings was about to be announced, and Endeavor had now received the title of the #1 hero, although it was done in a way that he truly did not feel satisfied in. For Endeavor, he had truly wondered where he had lost his way. His son had become a Power Ranger or whatever it was, and was now paving his own path without him. More and more it seemed as though the two of them were splitting and coming at odds, and it seemed as though they would never be able to rekindle their relationship, if they could even say they had one to begin with. In the meantime, more Nomu were starting to attack the city, one even going as far as to push Endeavor to his absolute limits. Although thankfully Endeavor would have the help of the #2 hero, the young up-and-coming star known as Hawks. However, even with the defeat of the now more advanced Nomu. And just as it seemed as though hope were starting to come on the horizon for the young heroes, there loomed a darkness that was not too far out in the distance, not just in their own world, but across the multiverse. Lord Draken was growing tired of the failures, and he had now decided that soon the day of reckoning was going to come. As he was now gathering his armed forces together, he was preparing to lead his own crusade. It was time to enter into the final phase of his plan, the conquering of the Ranger multiverse. And he knew where he wanted to start. It would be in the universe where the power coins of his world had been stolen all those years ago. That is where the grounds for his conquest would begin, and he would finish what he started once and for all, to become the Ranger God. This concludes What If Deku Was a Power Ranger? Heroes of the Morphing Grid, Part 10. As always, if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is Power Core Productions and Podcastings. I'm Javon Harrington signing off, and I will see you next time.